Thank you, Alexandros. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Please let me know if there's any problems. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, I was based in Cardiff, Met, worked with Alexandros for quite a while, and my interest has been very much in creativity and innovation over many, many years. I come from quite a technical background originally, but at Cardiff I was based at the School of Art and Design for almost 19 years. So that mixture of arts and sciences is something very important to me. At the Royal College of Art, I run two master's programs, one called Innovation Design Engineering, one called Global Innovation Design. And they're both master's programs that are run jointly with Imperial College London. And so the whole point of them is to bring together that art and design together with engineering to see how we can create new sort of solutions and impact on the world and innovation in general. So right at the end, I'm going to give you a little bit, some of the examples, some just current little project that some of the students have been doing, just so you can get a feel for some of the work that's happening. But I wanted to talk mainly for about 40 minutes, that's roughly the plan, on the topic of sort of factors that affect creativity and how we can support creativity and maybe help that flourish. So I'm going to talk about various different elements throughout the talk and give you a few examples, but I'm really going underneath the hood rather than talking about applications too much. So I'm going to talk about things about purpose, the idea of coherence, insight, and movement. I don't know if you associate those with creativity, so that's why I thought might be worth sort of raising those as things to reflect on, perhaps. So I thought I'd start with a nice quote that I particularly like. It was from a book on talking about creativity that I saw, and it was an extract from the life of Mozart in his correspondence. And I thought it was particularly apt, being a musical genius and famous for creating pieces so quickly and with very little correction, actually. But then he's reflecting on his own sort of times when he comes up with his ideas, his musical pieces. And I'll read it out. It says, "When I am, as it were, completely and entirely alone and of good cheer," I can see this is slightly cut off. I can see in some of the elements, perhaps in the layout, or traveling in a carriage, or walking, or having a good meal, or during the night when I cannot sleep. It is in such occasions that my ideas flow best and most abundantly. So I think it's quite interesting for me that he's talking about a context, an environment where his ideas come to him best. He talks about being in good cheer, but he's talking about being entirely alone, and in those types of situations, probably without distraction, that those ideas flow best. So I just want to sort of start the talk by highlighting maybe why that is the case and some research that's been looking into these types of ideas. There's a famous professor called Professor Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book called Flow and then wrote a book called Creativity. And flow he describes as being a fully immersive sort of activity, a fully immersive, either a physical or mental activity. And this is, for a lot of the research that he's done, both qualitatively and quantitatively, has shown that this is a sort of key state that's associated with good, high creative output. It's also an area that I've done quite a lot of research in and found that to be true too. And he looks at various aspects, which I won't go into the detail, but you can see that it links to emotion as well as to attention. So an anxious state, it can't be a flow state. A relaxation state can't be a flow state. And if you look at the axes on this diagram, it also talks about skill level versus challenge. And when they're both in balance and high, that's one of the attributes associated with being in this creative flow state. Goes on to say that people enter a state of flow when they are more open, more alert, and flexible within the attentional structure of the activity. This idea of alertness and attention is a very important underlying component of creativity, and therefore distraction can be quite harmful, unless in some other circumstances we might touch on later where it might be beneficial. But on the sort of default case, it's probably harmful to that creative insight. Another way of looking at creative flow or characterizing creative flow is by thinking of it as a combination of both high levels of attention, but in this open, alert sense, combined with positive emotion. And when you've got the two together, then you're the most powerful. This sort of image I sort of redrew based on work by Pfeiffer et al. And they talk about flow experience versus physiological arousal, which you can measure, for example, with heart rate. And there's a sort of peak point when you're at your best in terms of this physiological state. So this is not just a state of mind, but the state of your body too. If your arousal is too high, you're in this fight or flight mode and stress, and even though you might have high attention, that doesn't equate to creative flow. But equally, if you're in a state of boredom and maybe low physiological arousal, that also is not conducive to your peak state. So it's not about just being relaxed or bored. It's a lot more than that. In fact, often your heart rate goes slightly up when you're in this creative flow, but it's, as I say, linked with positive emotion. So an area I've done quite a lot of research over the last 10 years is looking at measures that you can look at that sort of psychophysiological state. And one of the well-known markers used for monitoring this is heart rate variability. So I've used heart rate variability because it's an information that connects both the heart and the brain, and can extract information from that signal to look at levels of, or estimate levels of attention on levels of stress. And so therefore you can do physiological measurements and compare that against creative output. And you can sort of prove quite sort of formally the sort of information I've given you on the previous slides, that this state of attention and positive emotion is one of the most effective states for being in a creative flow and coming up with creative ideas. So to me, it also then highlights the idea in this sort of area of embodied cognition, the extended mind. So it's not about creativity, it's not just in the mind. You can record this physiologically, it's also in the body, and it's also affected by the environment. So the brain, the body, environment all play a role in that creative performance. And creativity is not just creating with ideas in thought, but maybe through physical actions and activities. So it's also thinking in this broader sense, in my view. Therefore, I like to think of creativity and this state more as a state of being, including your physical and mental and emotional states, and not just a mental state alone. And this state of being that's associated with this sort of flow state. My colleague Gina Deininger, who's done a lot of research on creativity with me, talks of it as a cohesive state, a state of openness and a state of mental stillness. So that's an alert, but the mind is not full of chatter. It's not full of thought. It is open and flexible and attentive and sensitive to everything around. But the sense of cohesion also implies the sense of linking between body and mind as being important for the creative state. A famous physicist, David Bohm, has done some really interesting research, in my opinion, on creativity. And one of the books I really like is called On Creativity. And in that book, he says this. He says, creativity is always founded on the sensitive perception of what is new and different from what is inferred from previous knowledge. And he refers to this, whether that be in the arts or the sciences. This is the principle holds true throughout. But he says, seeing something new and unfamiliar requires that one be attentive, alert, aware, and sensitive, which is very much in line with what Csikszentmihalyi was talking about in terms of the flow state. So to me, this is a really interesting point, because if you go back, it says, founded on the sensitive perception of what is new and different from what is inferred from previous knowledge. So saying that, in a way, your thoughts alone, which is usually based on previous knowledge, cannot be the only thing and cannot be the trigger for creativity. It's actually the sensitive perception of what is new and different from that current thought process that gives you that creative spark. So this comes to my sort of first key term, which is insight. And so my argument to you is that insight comes from the way that David Bohm, or can come from the way that David Bohm describes it. And so therefore, insight doesn't come from thought. It comes from the differences between thought and the senses, if you want. So what you perceive in the world, and that your senses interact with, maybe through your eyes, through your ears, through your touch, through your physicality, versus what your thoughts are. That sense of difference and something new gives you the insight, if you are sensitive and alert to that. So if you're in this creative flow state, if you want, the state of being that's cohesive. But that's only an insight. That's not enough to maybe fully develop creative ideas or get broader creative work moving forward. So the other word I want to introduce is this idea of movement, and of movement between things and between spaces, movement of thought, movement of action, movement of perception, movement between people, movement between objects, playing with objects, all these listening, observing, all these types of movements between these types of activities linked with that creative flow state, I would argue, are the key elements that underlie creativity to flourish. So I've mapped that into a model which I call the LCD model for creativity, and the sort of the shapes, the blue and the red and the greens, hopefully imply that there's movement between these different activities of predominantly listening or observing, connecting with new ideas, with new people, with new situations, but then also doing, making things, prototyping things if we took in the context of design, creating pieces of art, creating music, painting. All these are activities of doing. And this movement between these activities through this state of being that is key to be alert and sensitive to these differences, as David Bohm talks about, between thought and the new senses, is where the ideas then will flow. So if you're listening and connecting with others, you're doing that through empathy because you're in that sensitive state. If you're doing a work or music and then you can pause to reflect, that comes back to the listening. Not just obviously doing this externally of listening to others, but also listening internally. So that idea of pausing and self-reflection, going back into the idea space from the spaces of doing and reality and senses. So this movement, and of course, connecting with others and doing this collaboratively allows more creative spark because, again, this creates more opportunity for sparking that opportunities for differences between what you're doing and what you think. And therefore, you get that chance for more insights to come about. Therefore, you get a chance to enhance creativity. So insight and movement go hand in hand. This movement between the spaces of ideas and sort of physical senses of reality are key to make this happen. So that's why I have this model of creativity here. But when we look at that then in more detail, we look at the idea of the sort of doing part, whether that be creating pieces of art or music or design or engineering, what other elements would link to that? Well, I want to introduce the idea of play and playfulness. Play is an activity, it's a doing activity, but a beautiful activity because it also combines that state of being, which I talked about as being very important to enhance creativity, with that activity somewhat naturally. Because when you're playing, you are open-minded, usually you're receptive, you're relaxed. You try out stuff, you make mistakes, you learn. But that's okay, because there are no real negative consequences. By definition, you're playing. So it's a wonderful way to explore, and therefore often play is a natural tool, an activity you can do as a foundation to support the opportunities for creativity to happen and insights to happen. When you look at the aspects of play, they're often about joy, safety. In fact, it's almost, you just, by definition, you can't play unless you feel safe. Freedom, spontaneity, the absence of consequences, self-consciousness disappearing, and also immediate feedback on your actions. So it very much is in line with that movement and that insight. And it also links to that positive emotion and attention that I talked about that were key at the beginning for creativity. So you can see that play is a natural way, if you're ever stuck, to try and get yourself into that state of activity and mind and being, to enhance that chances for creativity. So doing play, I would argue, you're naturally in this flow state. You are open, you're aware, and you're attentive, and you're sensitive, and you're immersed, as Csikszentmihalyi said, in that activity, mental or physical or combination of two. And that is the natural way that play can work. When I was back in Cardiff, for a few years, I ran a module on play and creativity and encouraged my students to play. This is some photos of some of my students. It was a very rainy time. I think it was in January and February a few years ago. And so there were a lot of broken umbrellas around the streets. They picked them up and just played with what they could make, from kites to hats to dresses to swings and so on. And created some flower designs and beautiful things they made just from the materials that they found lying around. And they just had a lot of fun. But it's just one of the quotes from the students here during that project. And it says that when you are playing, you're in the moment. You don't think about your problems, things that you have to do. You're really living it in the more natural way for you to be. And I thought that was just beautifully captured. And they created some beautiful work during those modules that I spent with the students on that type of exploration. But that's all well and good, but people often struggle to sustain levels of creativity. And so it's always good to reflect on, maybe for yourself, when you're at your most creative and when you're not, where you get your best ideas and when you struggle, and maybe where you have periods where you find it difficult to sustain levels of creativity. Well, if you look at what often people say, that factors that maybe can stifle or even kill creativity, these are some of the ones that might cause it, and not necessarily always, but this idea of expectation, because that can maybe lead to stress. If it does lead to stress, that, as you saw from the sort of flow states, can take you out of that flow state and affect your performance. Expectation sometimes can help you pay attention, which might be a good thing. So if you can maintain that positive emotion, it wouldn't necessarily be a creativity killer. But other factors that can put you in that anxious or fearful state, which is fear of judgment and fear of failure, and that again can harm your creative performance. And if you take the opposite emotion of apathy, that can also have an equally negative effect, because when you're apathetic, generally you won't be able to pay attention and engage. So maybe the first few affect more your emotion and the last one affects more your attention levels, perhaps. So the combination of these things are critical to consider. But if I go back to Csikszentmihalyi, he says that when his study of highly creative people, there was one key common element. Didn't matter where and what subject they did, what domain they worked in, the common element for all of them was that they loved what they did. So this idea of passion and enjoyment naturally puts you in a positive emotion and it naturally engages you. So this idea of thus having a sense of purpose and doing what you love that's meaningful to you is extremely important if you want to enhance your creativity, because again, that's a natural way to pull you into creative, engaged acts where you're sensitive and you've got a positive emotion. The other thing I think is important about this idea of purpose and loving what you do is that when you are sensitive and alert, that sense of purpose gives you a direction and a guidance and allows maybe easier connections between ideas and thoughts versus new senses and interactions you have in the world, and then linking them together. And the linking part is driven to some sense by that purpose. Without that purpose, how do you make that connection between the ideas and the senses that you have? Purpose is often the glue that triggers that insight. Another thing to be aware of is that actually we are naturally intrinsically motivated to be creative. So work by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci on self-determination theory talks about this, and he says that we naturally want to seek out novelty and challenges. We want to extend and exercise our capacities. We want to explore and we want to learn. Actually, our natural state is to be creative. So as long as we can marry that with the sense of where we want to put that into action. I mean, it could be just through the act of it, through in the sense that this is play, isn't it? It's almost a definition of play, that we get that. But play can have a purpose. And if we bring it with a purpose, then it can be very powerful. And the other thing that Richard Ryan and Edward Deci highlight is that this purpose helps provide this energy for action. It gives us this natural drive to want to engage and energy to work at quite a high level of activity, but with a positive emotion. So again, the sense of purpose is crucial in terms of putting us in a state that is conducive to creativity. So when creativity can be sustained, creativity can be sustained more when anchored in purpose, therefore. So I guess if you're struggling or you're not sure or you feel your creativity is waning, maybe the first place to start is reflecting on, are you doing what you love? And are you doing something that matters for you, something that's meaningful for you, something significant for you? If you think about these things, then you maybe get that energy of action and this engagement with a positive emotion. And then when you are alert and playful and exploring in that space, then that's the chance to really enhance and make a difference to your creativity. So I've talked about insight and movement. And as I mentioned, I feel that these two to go together. So I'm going to show you an image now, I guess, of just this idea of this movement between the idea space, which is below the zero line, and the reality space above the line, and this idea of the x-axis being this learning and growth. And so the idea of moving between ideas and thoughts and actions and senses, and it comes back to this central point each time through the zero, which is the point where the two link together to give you those insight. But what brings those two together is this sense of purpose. And without that, you cannot get this movement into the center and back out to this expansion. So this idea of movement between spaces of ideas and action and this expansion out, but back in through purpose and insight is really important in my view in terms of that creative work. And then what you hopefully saw is that expansion out in terms of learning. So every time you feed back in a loop, you get some new learning, you get some new ideas, and then you can build on that further and further. So that's how we learn, that's how we grow, that's how we create, that's how we develop ideas. So it's building either through your own work, if you're working with others, through building with others and going on this growth curve to develop your ideas further forward. So that comes to my one of my last keywords, which is this idea of coherence. So it's not about just ideas. It's not just about doing activities of listening or observing or making or playing. These are all part of this unified whole, and they all need to work together in this movement between these different spaces. And with your state of being, that cohesive state is the glue that allows this wholeness to happen and this quality of forming this unified wholeness. So that's why this idea of mind, body, and environment to me is an important part that fits into this idea of this creative space. So coherence to me is an important term if you want to sort of enhance your creativity. And of course, there's also links then to linking with others and seeing not yourself as different from others or competitors with others, but through cooperation and seeing this united whole, you can take on much bigger challenges because there's more broader set of maybe interdisciplinary skills, different perspectives, different ideas. So you've got that broader connectivity, this broader capability for doing, and therefore, coming back to Csikszentmihalyi's idea of challenge versus skill, you can take on bigger challenges because as a group of interdisciplinary workers, you've got a broader set of skills. So therefore, you can take on much more challenging tasks And the task, I guess, we face in the world, this is my area, I guess, interested in for my work in RCA, is getting the students to have this understanding and these skills so they can tackle some of these really difficult, complex, interwoven challenges that face us in the world. And this idea of this wholeness and systems thinking is important as part of creativity as much as small elements. So that's my sort of broader sort of ideas and thoughts behind the ideas that have influenced me in terms of creativity. I just wanted to give you just some examples now where I've sort of explored that a little bit further, and then also finish with some of the work that the students are doing, just been doing recently. So one project that I did was starting to look at how I could use this heart rate variability information and perhaps provide it as real-time biofeedback visually to a person. I could have done that using sort of ECG sensors on the heart, on the chest, or whatever, but I decided to try and do it directly with the sort of pulse information, which is sort of close marker to heart rate that you can pick up from smart watches. The downside of that is those signals are not as good as picking it up from the ECG signal directly, but obviously the advantage is the ease with which you can gather that data versus other types of methods. So the idea was that I picked up the pulse rate information from the watch in real time. I fed that through Bluetooth to the smartphone, and then I analyzed that heart rate variability signal. For those of you who know the technical side, looking at power spectrum and extracting with various other slight methods, an estimate of attention and the estimate of the stress or relaxation levels from that signal in real time. But then I fed that back directly in various visual forms onto the screen of the smartphone so that the people interacting with the smartphone are getting some visual representation of their state of being in close to real time. It was about a 10 to 15 second delay between the sensor and the data fed back of their state of being visually on the screen. So my interest in one of the studies I did was to both develop this software and to see if people could train and improve their levels of attention and relaxation or sort of positive emotion together, and were they capable of doing that? In other words, could we get them into a state of being that was more conducive for creativity? And once they recognize that state, maybe that's something that they can use. Or maybe in the future we could use this in a way that you could have this monitored and more sort of in the background if you wanted it to. So this idea of using real-time biofeedback of the heart rate variability data to do that. So I coined this term in the paper I wrote on this stuff, was called relaxed concentration. I'm not sure actually it's the best word. I would probably say it's attention and positive emotion, but that's the phrase I used at this time. I think concentration and attention maybe is not quite the same, and attention is probably a better word, but that's the word I used at that time. So yeah, these are the watch I used because it was easier to track, not as accurate. So you can see if you do a sensor on the ear, the type of data that you get in terms of pulse cycle intervals versus when you pick it from the watch with the darker line, and you can see it's much more smoothed out. In other words, I'm not getting as much variability data with the watch as I am with the ear. So that's bad because obviously I'm losing a lot of useful information to be accurate on assessing attention and emotional state. But I wanted to see was that still good enough? What it turned out, I can show you the slides on this, it turned out it was good enough for my purposes to get certainly basic levels of attention and stress and relaxation that people were using. So then I designed 3 different user interfaces as games, basically, to see how people performed. So I got them to just sit quietly for a minute and actually just focus on the breathing and slowing their breathing down to get them naturally to start with in a decent state. And then I gave them one of 3 different games and interfaces to play. The first game was basically 4 squares, and on the x-axis on the right-hand side was when they were most relaxed, and on the x-axis on the left-hand side is when they're most stressed. On the y-axis, when they were on the top, when they were most focused, and in other words, attention, and at the bottom when they were most distracted. And the ball, the blue ball, represented their current feedback state from the heart rate variability data. So that represented where they were sitting in real time in terms of their state of being, of attention and levels of relaxation or stress. And the numbers represent how long, how many seconds they've been in any one of those states. So in this case, this is a screenshot where the person has been jumping between different states during that actual game interaction. In this case, they've spent 42 seconds in the green zone, 32 seconds in the bottom right-hand yellow zone, and so on and so forth. So this was a game where I separated attention from relaxation. So if they were, for example, relaxed but not attentive, they could focus on being more attentive. If they were attentive but not relaxed, they could focus on relaxing and try and see what state would get them into that most conducive state. So that was one game I did a lot of studies with. The second game, I did the more classic, sort of very old style bird flying game. And the bird was flying, and the idea was the height with which you are the bird. If you're the biofeedback rather than the blue ball, you are the bird. And this time it was a combined measure of attention and relaxation. So if you're highly attentive and relaxed, you would fly high in the sky. If you were not attentive and relaxed, you would crash down and crash into the mountains. And as you went through the clouds, you got points. And the score you can see at the very bottom left. And it was quite interesting for this because as you moved through the scene, the mountains got bigger. So I did this deliberately to see if you could see the big mountains coming that would create more an anxious state, and whether you were able to hold that relaxed concentration state in such a knowing that that's coming. So that was the second game I designed. And then the last game was a more gentle game. Again, this combined relaxed concentration score rather than separating the two. But in this case, flowers started to appear on the tree if you were in this high sort of relaxed concentration mode, and flowers would fall off the tree and if you're in a low sort of scoring relaxed concentration. So in the end, the game was to how many flowers you could create on the tree, and that was sort of your game challenge, as it were. So each of them had a game element, a challenge to it, and I could monitor their performance sort of indirectly from, for example, how many times they're in this certain top right-hand zone in the first game, or how many clouds they flew through and got points in the second one, or how many flowers were on the tree. And then I also recorded various other pieces of data. And then I could estimate concentration levels, ease of concentration, relaxation levels, ease of relaxation, and this idea of pleasantness. And what it turned out to be is that the tree game turned out to be the most effective in getting people quite easily into that state, because it didn't create a level of anxiousness. And they found it quite, even though they could see when they were coming out of the state, if flowers were falling off the tree, they could move themselves back in to that state relatively easily without too much stress. And what was interesting for me is that pretty much all people were found it pretty easy after a few goes at playing certainly the tree game of getting themselves into this state very easily. And so I guess what I learned from that is that a few things. One is it is possible to use this biofeedback of your own psychophysiological state to help you improve your levels of attention and relaxation. So it might be a useful tool in that regard. Also, that how you design software and can either enhance that state or make that state worse and affect the performance. So you could damage creativity, for example, as a consequence. And therefore, and also that motivation levels had a big, if you start to get bored and become apathetic, then coming back to my broader points, that would affect you being able to stay in that state too. That's just an example of how I've done some explorations and a whole range of studies on play. I've just picked that one to show you how you can use some of the digital technology to explore some of these spaces. I worked with a company called Rescape, and they're still developing this work. This is a VR company in medical health, and they're using these exact same principles of biofeedback using EEG signals rather than ECG, and creating scenes similar in the same principle that I described with the smartphone. But this is the whole point, is to get them into this emotional state to reduce their stress levels in hospital environments where they might be very anxious about upcoming operations. So that's actually where they were looking to do it. So I think it's quite a nice example how they've allowed people. So it's an immersive state, an attentive state, but in a positive emotion, and they can use the biofeedback to help enhance that. So that was quite a nice piece of work. So finally, I know I've only got a few minutes left. I just wanted to just give you an example and a little bit of context about the work I'm doing at the Royal College of Art. So as I mentioned, I'm head of 2 master's programs. They're actually double master's programs that have run over 2 years each, and they're both run jointly with Imperial College London. So one called Global Innovation Design, and one's called Innovation Design Engineering. And underlying both of them is this philosophy that I talked about earlier of trying to create a structure and a curriculum where these ideas and aspects that I've been covering so far are embedded in sort of curriculum design, so we can really hopefully get the students to be the most creative and innovative they can be. So really about combining this idea of arts and sciences to increase that knowledge, that skill set, that connectivity, and to enhance the ideas space, and creativity being at its heart. So I just wanted to finish for the last 2 minutes and just show you, this is what I'm just going to show you is a small project just done over 4 weeks. So this is, and these for the first year's students and in their first term. So they're quite new, they haven't developed very much. And it's also important to note that the students we recruit onto the course come from everywhere in terms of backgrounds. We have anthropologists, we have business people, we have engineers, mechanical, electrical, civil, we have architects, we have fashion designers, we have journalists and video anthropologists. We have whole mix of people, product designers, obviously a lot of people from the design and graphic background. So they come together. Some of them are knowledgeable in this sort of tech space, which I'm going to show you, and some of them are not. But I'm just going to show you a 2-minute video to show some of the work they produce. And we put them into pairs, and they're given 4 weeks to come up with a creative piece of work that brings together electronics, mechanical, product design, software, and they could do anything they wanted to, but just by exploring and playing with these technologies. So I'm going to start it from the beginning and put the sound on. So that's it from me. Hopefully you found that useful and some insights. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Okay. Let me move across. Okay, some people I recognize here. So considering the creativity is related to the body and mind health, as well as positive emotions, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected the potential creative ideas and project outcomes? Good question. I think it has affected it. I've seen that in the students, actually, is that now we've been back in the studio since September. It has had a major positive impact because that's idea of play and playfulness. If COVID also affects you, psychologically and emotionally, that does affect your creativity. If you aren't able to play and physically interact and give yourself new experiences, how are you going to give yourself the chance to thrive and create more ideas? So I think it has had an impact on mental health, and therefore has also had an impact on on creativity and interaction and new experience. So new ideas come about by making new connections in your brain. So if you can't make those new connections, then that's going to be limited. Obviously, you can do stuff online, but I don't think as effectively. So that's my thought on that one. Oliver says, I am interested in the idea of flow state connecting to mental and physical activity. But how might it be possible to achieve flow state just through mental activity? I wonder whether, for example, mathematicians feel they achieve a flow state. Yeah, I think you can do it purely in a mental activity, I guess, is my immediate answer. Because I think if you're naturally engaged, I'm first and foremost, in terms of my core skill, I'm a programmer. I can get immersed in programming. And when I was younger, I could for hours, and time would fly by and I wouldn't notice it had gone. I think you can, and if you're doing that in a joyous state, it can be very effective. I mean, it's always good to think about when you have your best ideas, because your environment does affect you. Often when I ask people when they have their best ideas, they might say, well, lying in bed at night, or having a shower, or going for a walk, or going for a run or a cycle. For me, a lot of my best ideas came lying in bed at night or walking, and that was a pure mental activity, because I'm paying attention without distraction, and I'm in a positive emotion, and therefore you suppress that noise chatter, that thought chatter, and allow that stuff to come up more from the unconscious into the conscious. Another thing you can do to enhance that is, I guess I was trying to imply through training, is things like mindfulness training, because they are basically attention training methods, but with a positive emotion. So that's another way that you can enhance your capability for increasing your flow state for mental activity. The master's degree you run at Royal College of Art with the works in the video is a degree in which people are applying from varied backgrounds, including art, engineering. Yeah, if I understand it, you are exactly understanding that correctly. So they get a Master of Arts and a Master of Sciences. They get 2 masters in the 2-year program. And the first year, we expose them to obviously some of these underlying principles and philosophy, but we also expose them to a whole range of experiences. So, for example, if I briefly say what they've been doing, but that play and experimentation is probably at the heart of it. But for example, that module that you saw was called Gizmo. That ran for about 4 weeks. We've just finished a module called Superform, which is where they had to make a chair, but with a creative design of a chair. So that actually finished yesterday. So I was in 10 hours of assessments yesterday for that one. But that was also equally fascinating because that was around physical making, obviously, and some were more experienced than others, but that creative element still shone through, even if their skills weren't so strong. And then the other area that they're about to do is around people, so about anthropology and getting out and understanding culture and people. So we take them through a whole range of different skill sets where some, depending on their background, some are strong, some are weak, but no one's strong in all the subjects. But by the end, you get this idea of breadth. There's this relatively recent book called Range, which sort of brings some of these ideas in a more sort of colloquial sense together. But is that idea of principle is that you need that breadth and that interdisciplinary to tackle these challenges. So that's why we expose them as we do. Is that okay? I don't see, apart from hi from Angie, who I know very well. Hi, Angie. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I can hear you, but yeah. Could they hear me? Do you know? Okay. Okay, maybe type it in then, and I will I will read it out. You tell me, and I can repeat the question anyway. Yeah, you tell me that there's a technical problem that you can't hear Alexandros, but I'm telling him to tell me the question. I will repeat it so then everybody can know the question. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So Alexander's question is, how can you? I guess he knows I have an interest in mindfulness and meditation, which is true, and how could that link to creativity? I think the interesting thing for me, I have done meditation for about 30 years. So it's something that I'm fascinated by, partly because I had various experiences that sort of made me intrigued, partly as a scientist to what was going on. And I also realized that I could use that state as a sort of tool as well. Allow my own creative thoughts to flow. So one of the principles behind mindfulness specifically is about attention without judgment. So it's not attaching meaning, certainly negative meaning to things. So often, if you're learning it for the first time, they might give you a tool such as focus on your breath, or something like that, because neutral meaning. Therefore, you can be alert and attentive with a positive emotion. So it's a way of putting you into that state, which is a state that I've just talked about. It's closely linked to a flow state. Lots of research, including my own, can show quite strongly that has a positive effect on creativity. So if you can train yourself to get yourself into that state, that's going to be helpful. I'm a pretty chilled person, generally speaking. But if you're very anxious and so on, this might be a problem to allow that nervousness and the brain always going 100 miles an hour. That can sometimes be a block to your creative thoughts. Mindfulness can be a way to help you do that. The problem I have with it is that I struggle to sit still. So for me, the way I was taught to do meditation was not to focus on the breath, but to focus on the body, more broadly. So I used to look at my hands and let my hands move. And as I'm paying attention, usually with my eyes close to my hands, there's this connection and attention to my hands, connecting both in my body and my mind together. So it creates that cohesiveness that I found quite enjoyable, and also allows me to get into that. So it's not about not having thoughts coming and going, because it's also this idea about movement. It's not about saying we have no thoughts. But it's not being attached to thoughts. So if you have this movement between thoughts, and I talked about this movement already, it allows maybe these new ideas to come up rather than you being stuck in a rut of a certain way of thinking. Yeah. Okay. Happy mixed, yeah. No problem. No problem. Hopefully. No problem. I hope the rest of the time that with this these events go well. So yeah, good luck with everything for the next day or so. Yeah, enjoy it. A positive emotion with attention. Yes. All right. Thank you all. Bye.